global theme, which is death. And pretty international, because we're going beyond all boundaries, life and death, and so on and so forth. So I figure I'm going to fit right into that a different way of looking at the global and the international, if you'll forgive me. All right, so I wrote this thing out, so I'll do it in the standard kind of style. As you know, the title is Truth Beautiful or Deadly? It's the Immodest inquiry. I'm not going to talk about the truth at all in the topic. I'll talk about something else. Let me tell you a story. A was born, lived, and died. And another story. B was born, lived, and died. And another. C and D were born, lived, and died. And another. E and F and G were born, lived, and died. These are good stories, aren't they? Yet, are they stories? Surely the plural is inappropriate here, for they are all really only one story, which I can summarize with ease. Born, lived, died. To recall Caesar, natus sum vixi mortus sum. And this is your story too. Each one of you fundamentally has but one story. Indeed, this story condenses all of human history into its three basic elements. It is the story of human history. So, why do we complicate it so? Why are we so unsatisfied with this simple story? What's wrong with it? Born, we live and die. But we're not content, it seems to me, merely to die. No, we do what we can to avoid this simple plot. We complicate, we twist, distort, stretch. We try to find a way out of this simple story, or around it, or above and beyond it. Perhaps I should rephrase what I just said. Perhaps all of human history is a history of the ways we try to evade this simple story. Born, lived, died. To hide it away somewhere safe where it cannot return to bother us. Though, of course, it always does return no matter what we do. All of human history, then, either openly or in a remarkably, seemingly inexhaustible variety of concealments, is a negotiation with this simple story. Put bluntly, it's a negotiation with death. A necessarily unfair negotiation, since we have so few bargaining chips. Now, a very strange character, an ugly, garrulous, odd, monstrously sly satyr, Socrates, claimed that the final aim of philosophy, the love of wisdom, the longing to find the right story, was to learn how to die well. In the words of a much more recent philosopher, to learn how to live finally. What is that? Why would we want to learn to die well? Why instead would we not want to learn to live well? Why the emphasis on death? Is that not morbid? Un-American? Of course, this emphasis seems unlovely, to say the least, perhaps even tragic. What do I mean by that? You know how the word tragedy is thrown about nowadays. Every accident, death, fire, molestation, etc. is called a tragedy. There are tragedies on basketball courts, in boardrooms, even in the vulgar artifice of the Kardashian bedroom. But what does that mean? I confess that I fail to understand these tragedies. They seem to equate tragedy with any sort of accident. I suppose I could stub my toe and call that a tragedy too. Perhaps that is tragic, but likely only for the comfort-loving bourgeois who fears whatever takes his or her comfort away. A fear now so exaggerated that it finds tragedy everywhere, the tragedy of the truly dull human being. Yet the bourgeois is onto something, which we can grasp better if we turn to Socrates, or more precisely, to the context of the fabulously rich and endearing Athenian society of which he was an exceedingly garrulous part. In this Socratic context, we are tragic beings because we live the simple story. Because we cannot help but live this simple story. No matter what we do or how we strive, we end up back at the beginning with the simple story. Born, lived, died. We are reminded of the simple story when we hurt, and we fall back to the beginning when the hurt is so terrible that it either maims or kills us. And these kinds of hurts await us all, without exception, as far as we know. This is the poverty of our human state, our wretched vulnerability. We may clothe ourselves splendidly, we may arm ourselves with riches or the most formidably complex constructions of modern science, but we still stand poor and unshod before death. That simple story, monotonously repeated through the ages. Recall the majestic first stasiemon from Sophocles' Antigone, the so-called Ode to Man. And I quote, "Wonders and terrors abound, but none is more wondrous and terrible than man. He crosses to the far side of white seas, blown the low, huge waves. He wears earth down, our primal, eternal, inexhaustible God. His stallion-sired mules plowing her soil, back and forth, year after year. All breeds of carefree bird, savage beast, and deep-sea creature, ingenious man snares in his woven nets. He drives the mountain herds, from wild lairs down to his folds. He coaxes rough-maned horses to thrust their necks through his yoke. He tames the tireless mountain bull. He has taught himself speech, wind-quick thought, and all the talents that govern a city. How to take shelter from cold skies or pelting rain. Never baffled, always resourceful, he accepts every challenge. But from Hades alone, he has found no way out. Though from hopeless disease, he has found some sort of defense." End of quote. Despite the terrible wonders of which we are capable, we are undeniably frail and ugly, children of Poros and Penia, resourcefulness and poverty, as Socrates tells us, through the agency of a prophetess. Are we thus ugly beings, a cosmic joke, playthings of maleficent deities? Would it be better simply not to have been born, not to live this stupidly simple story? If this is the story behind this stupidly simple story, who could argue against suicide without basely lying to him or herself? But is this the story? Are we not beautiful in our ugliness? There is another view, a comic one. The comic, in the Socratic context, we are comic because we live the simple story, because we cannot help but live the simple story. Does that sound familiar? The same story that gives birth to the tragic gives birth to its apparent antipode. What then is the comic from this perspective? That very ugliness which the tragic decries, the comic embraces with delight and exuberance, though it does so not always benevolently or delightedly. The comic embraces repetition and failure. Repetition and failure constitute the lifeblood of the comic, and neither is always that funny. Think of Samuel Beckett, for example. His famous novel, Murphy, begins with a limpidly laden line. I quote, "The sun shone, having no alternative, on the nothing new." End of quote. The exuberant alliteration of this morbid opening belies its ostensive morbidity. The sadness of repetition, and do recall our story, born, lived, died, stands mocked. But the fun does not stop here. A few lines later, we find ourselves confronted with a main character, Murphy, who has tied himself to a chair, well, it seems, engaging in a peculiar, if common act of autoerotic emancipation. The nothing new, indeed. But as Beckett writes elsewhere, fail again, fail better. What is comic about this kind of failure? Just why is it so funny, if you find it funny? There is the element of the grotesque, the exaggerated, the buffo, of buffoonery. Murphy, tied to a chair, having it off with himself as a sort of parody of the simple story, is inventive, biting, and strange all at once. And this is precisely the point. Invention is the heart of the comic, in fact. The comic is the realm of fantasy, the realm of Aristophanes' bird kingdom, his chorus of frogs barking brickacoex, coax, coax, of deaths that are really rebirths or lead to resurrection. The comic celebrates that most licentious and dangerous human ability to imagine a world other than this one, to imagine a story other than our simple one, to imagine myriad stories, never-ending stories, complications, diversions, and divagations that refuse to terminate, refuse to coalesce into one dull, everyday shape. The comic embraces repetition and failure only to turn them inside out, to make them strange, wondrous, and terrible indeed, sort of like the intrepid wayfarer of Sophocles. The comic is resourcefulness incarnate. It delights in difference, in play, in rebellion without end. In this sense, the comic reaches to infinity via the imagination. Its irrepressible fecundity, its capacity to slip out of any trap, or better, to conceal that trap through pure imaginative power. Mark my words, the most terrible and wondrous aspect of our humanity is the imagination. It can dream kingdoms of unrestrained delight, fertility, magnificent utopias, or the most horrific prison houses and dungeons. The imagination is our greatest revolutionary and criminal. The comic is not always funny. And I might add, as an aside, that those who prefer that we be slaves must control and destroy the imagination, must ensure that we see only one picture, and believe that it is quite impossible to deviate from that picture. These are the tyrants who claim to love the truth, the one truth, the whole truth. For them, the comic is never welcome. God, as Goethe said, does not laugh. This brings us full circle, back to the beginning. Let me reprise my working definitions of the tragic and the comic as modes of response to that simple story with which we all begin and end. As I've put it, the tragic is a kind of lament over the simple story. A lament over the signal fact that none of us can extricate him or herself from the grip of this simple story. Tragedy asserts there's no way out. Yet it also asserts the heroism of refusing to submit, of refusing to bow down before this simple story. Tragedy would have us play the master and not the slave. The master here being a creature of the great refusal, the wholesale rejection of our stupid fate. The tragic hero becomes the satanic rebel, beloved of the romantics and bad modern movies and television. The rebel without a cause was mad, bad, and dangerous to know, what Jim Morrison wanted to be, if he hadn't turned out to be fat and silly. Note the heap of cliches that emerge here. We have turned one of the most formidable challenges to the simple story into kitsch, commercial fodder one can sell as breaking through to the other side. There is a comic twist to this, the elimination of the tragic through pathetic, uninspired emulation. The comic is also a sort of lament over the simple story, but it is a mocking lament at the wretched simplicity of that story, its dullness, monotony, stupidity. As I said, the comic celebrates resourcefulness, the new, movement in many directions. It is the rascal that gets away every time to create anew. It is creation itself, and thus delights in overturning, refashioning, and rebuilding. Above all, the comic is playful. It responds to our stupid fate by a show of sovereign, imaginative intelligence. One might put this distinction more simply. The tragic rejects the ugliness that it associates with the simple story, that of a creature born only to die, whereas the comic celebrates that ugliness, our poverty, by locating in that poverty resourcefulness, incredible resourcefulness, the riches of pure possibility. If we return to Socrates, Plato's Socrates, and the myth of Poros and Penia, resourcefulness and poverty, we might see just how brilliant this myth is as a characterization of the tragic and comic modes of apprehending our simple story. Penia is poverty, and the tragic bitterly rejects this poverty, as I just said. And the ones who would have us so, namely the gods or God. Poros is pure resourcefulness. It cannot stop playing. It imitates the flexibility of the gods or gods by hewing the unending, the infinite. Think of the great comic creations that offer us freedom from this story, the simple story. Think of eternal life, the heaven of Dante, or the visions of mystics and saints. This claim is no minor matter, nor flippancy on my part. The Greeks associate the person of virtue with the tragic hero. One becomes beautiful in seeking to overcome the simple story by literally contesting its hold over us. Achilles does so by choosing to die gloriously, rather than live a long and dull, but safe life. The comic hero has so much courage. The comic hero has no such courage. He is a jokester, the rogue, the man of many wiles. It should come as no surprise that Odysseus is more properly the distant forerunner of this kind of hero. And the marvelous poem describing his return to Ithaca is a brilliant showcase of the imagination, of the twists and turns of fate. Recall that Odysseus is the man of many ways. In this sense, Odysseus is a marked counterpoint to Achilles. For the great warrior age, the age of the tragic, Odysseus is suspect, not really to be admired. It is one of the great twists of fate that Christianity would reverse the Greek valuation of the tragic over the comic. For the Christian mind, the tragic hero becomes satanic, the one who challenges God, who seeks to be like God. The comic hero, the one who delights in poverty, becomes the beloved Christian hero. But of course, this comic hero is a very restrained one. He or she would not be allowed the lavish imaginative play of Aristophanes or Beckett, to put it mildly. Yet the Christian love of suffering cannot but embrace the comic mode. Now, you might reproach me. Why this long, inconclusive excursion into the tragic and comic? What does this really have to do with our simple story? More distressing, what does this have to do with the title of my talk? Am I deceiving you? Or am I perhaps just incompetent? I say perhaps both. But let me try to wiggle out of my corner to invent some sort of way forward for my argument, if indeed it may be said that I am making one. First things first. What does our excursion into the comic and tragic have to do with the simple story? I suppose the answer is obvious. Everything. Both comic and tragic are modes of response to the simple story. The one rejecting that story, and by extension stories in and of themselves, the other rejecting the story as well, but not stories in and of themselves. The tragic is a hatred of narrative, because the tragic bemoans our placement in time, whereas the comic delights in narrative, delights in its mutability, the possibility that time can be reshaped again and again. Or is that just cheap legerdemain on my part? Perhaps the real issue is a bit different. Perhaps both are tied together by a great refusal of a different kind. The tragic simply refuses to accept the simple story. The story is ugly and must be abolished. The tragic seeks out a sort of suicide. The comic does not. It seeks invention, play, diversion. Yes, we've heard that. The comic spirit is the spirit of illusion, and it prefers to conceal the simple story, to play pretend that the simple story is not the one and only story. And in this respect, the comic attitude is cowardly. It looks away. Here, I suppose, is the nub of the entire issue. Do we look or do we look away? A formidable question, to say the least. If we look, that is, if we consider the simple story as the story, the only story we can really know, how can we turn away from it? But then again, how can we not turn away from it? We can talk about comic and tragic until the rebirth of Jesus Christ, but we will get no further. We will indeed only hide the problem from ourselves by complicating it, contorting it, winding it up again and again. And in this sense, complication itself is a form of avoidance. Without having to face the austerity of the simple story, the three words, remember, born, lived, died. Simple. Too simple. Unbearably simple. We look away in discussing this simplicity. What a wondrous and terrible creature is man. We cannot help but turn away from the problem as we try to turn toward it. In other words, and there are always other words, the simple leaves us with nothing more to do. We stand silent before it because the simple is a kind of completion, a formulation of finality, a final word. But can we stand this silent finality? Speech is rebellion against the simple story, whether it be a lament, a yell, a hymn of praise, or a prayer. What a strange bind. What an ugly, deadly To be sure, this language is, that's end of quote, to be sure this language is dramatic. The old woman speaking here has, after all, only one buttock left. And she's been subjected to many terrors. But it nonetheless identifies a peculiar, even terrible tension. What is this tension? It's the same tension that the very great Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky describes a mere 100 years later in a central portion of the Brothers Karamazov, one of the summits of Western literature. In that sprawling novel, Ivan Karamazov backs himself into a most unpleasant corner. I quote, "But until my 30th year, I know this for certain. My youth will overcome everything, all disillusionment, all aversion to life. I've asked myself many times, is there such despair in the world as could overcome this wild and perhaps indecent thirst for life in me? And have decided that apparently there is not. That is, once again until my 30th year, after which I myself shall want no more, so it seems to me. Some snotty-nosed, consumptive moralists, poets especially, often call this thirst for life base. True, it's a feature of the Karamazovs. To some extent, this thirst for life, despite all, it must be sitting in you too. But why is it base? There is still a lot of centripetal force on our planet, Alyosha, the person he's talking to. I want to live. I do live, even if it be against logic." End of quote. What is so difficult to understand? What is against logic? Why do we have to live this simple story? Why are we born only to die? These questions, again, differently inflected, of course, but still the same questions, saying this again, again, and again. There truly is nothing new under the sun. But Ivan cannot help but look away. Even though he understands with perfect clarity the strangeness of our monotonous predicament, he is unable to follow that understanding to its conclusion. He is unable to commit suicide, to throw the cup away. He is, moreover, also unable to devote himself to living life as if he did not understand, or without understanding. Once awakened to the simple story, he cannot ignore it, nor can he live with it. He can neither fully reject nor fully embrace the simple story. He is a creature of equivocation, living hesitantly between differing possibilities without ever being able to overcome that hesitation. It is no wonder, then, that Ivan begins to see things, that his reality begins to take multiple shapes, that he becomes unable to distinguish between what is real and the weird children of his imagination. His hesitation resolves into madness. That is, the most radical form of irresolution, the most radical form of formlessness. Ivan escapes the bind I have described by surrendering, if that's the right word, to boundlessness, to the most inveterate freedom. He is truly international. So, an Oprah moment might be in order. Now, what is the life lesson to be gleaned from this? Does Ivan's case not reveal the corruption, or at least the mendacity of life lessons? Let's survey the territory we've traversed so far. In the beginning and end is our simple story. Born, lived, died. Born, lived, died. It's exciting? Yeah. We have brought forward two responses to this simple story, the tragic and the comic. The tragic response is defiance. Oh, this again. The simple story must be eliminated, either by suicide, stepping boldly forth to heaven, or transforming the feeble creature we are into some unlimited being. A sort of contradiction. By virtue of technology. We might say all these cases are forms of suicide. The comic response is defiance. The simple story is too simple. We can invent many others. We can pretend play like joyful children. We can even make believe that we shall live forever in some unearthly realm, whether it be created by wondrous fables, or indeed the power of modern technology. Yet another wondrous fable. We dream of other stories, always other dreams, and dreaming other stories. How interesting. In the context of the simple question that attends the simple story, why are we born only to die, I might associate the tragic with a direct rejection of death, and the comic with a rather more indirect rejection of death. In either case, the common element is most obviously rejection. A turning away from our simple story, the story of all our lives, even in turning toward it, as I've said, again and again. Are we not back again to where we started? We turn to look, and turn away. We turn around and around, always returning to where we started from. We are Sisyphus. The turn being either misery or a sort of diversion, tragic or comic. But what of Ivan? Whence his perspective and ours on this unceasing drama? And what does it mean to inhabit this higher perspective? How am I able to define comic and tragic? Are they separate from me? Are they the same? Or what are they? We could argue, indeed, that inhabiting this higher perspective is the most frightening, uncanny, indeed vertiginous freedom of all. We take a position beyond all positions, an impossible position or a very curious one. This is the position of the decision, not just any decision, but the momentous, fundamental decision. What is this decision? It is the decision for or against the simple story. What incredible freedom lies in this decision? The most divine, potent freedom any being could imagine, or any being that imagines could imagine. To live or not to live the story. You might say that this is the most vast, most unusual, and unadulterated freedom we can possibly claim to possess, if the latter is even the right word. Now the fateful question: how do I dispose of this freedom? How do I choose for or against? What guidance do I have in making such a decision? Am I left in the difficulties of Ivan Karamazov, unable to decide either for or against, locked in perpetual indecision and hesitation? So let's look at Ivan once again. He knows that we are subject to the simple story, and he seeks to confront that knowledge in some way, but cannot find any way. He argues, makes stories, plays different roles, lives, loves, and lies, but he cannot find a way to reconcile his knowledge of our terminal state with his desire to live. He stands in the bind, wound ever more tightly, in fact, into the bind of the simple story from which madness seems the only possible exit. Now, this sounds so existentialist, right? The grumblings of the Gothic imagination. So, what do we do? Where is the life lesson? Here's a palliative peroration and a dodge. The simple story. Our truth is both deadly and beautiful. The inability to choose one or the other with complete certainty is to live in an open space. An intolerable space, perhaps, but an open one. Dare you live that way, or do you decide once and for all? If you don't decide once and for all, what do you do? What do you do about the dare to live that way part? Imagine a different, wretchedly banal possibility. Acceptance of the simple story. Acceptance of its simplicity. Can one imagine that? Dare one imagine that? Should one imagine that? Let me leave you with a story, yet another story, this time from China, a civilization whose culture may not be so fatally constructed on the rejection of the simple story as ours seems to be. This story comes from the great Taoist sage Zhuangzi, and I quote, "When Zhuangzi was going to Zhu, he saw by the roadside a skull, clean and bare, but with every bone in its place. Touching it gently with his chariot whip, he bent over it and asked, 'Sir, was it some insatiable ambition that drove you to transgress the law and brought you to this? Was it the fall of a kingdom, the blow of the executioner's axe that brought you to this? Or had you done some shameful deed and could not face the reproaches of father and mother, of wife and child, and so were brought to this? Was it hunger and cold that brought you to this? Or was it that the springs and autumns of your span had in their due course carried you to this? Having thus addressed the skald, he put it under his head as a pillow and went to sleep. At midnight the skald appeared to him in a dream and said to him, "All that you said to me, your glib, commonplace chatter, is just what I should expect from a live man, showing as it does in every phase a mind hampered by trammels from which we dead are entirely free. Would you like to hear a word or two about the dead?" "I certainly should," said Clemson. "Among the dead," said the skald, "none is king, none is subject. There is no division of the seasons. For us the whole world is spring, the whole world is autumn. No monarch on his throne has joy greater than ours." Zhuangzi did not believe this. "Suppose," he said, "I could get the clerk of destinies to make your frame anew, to clothe your bones once more with flesh and skin, send you back to mother and father, wife and child, friends and home. I do not think you would refuse." A deep frown furrowed the skeleton's brow. "How can you imagine," it asked, "that I would cast away joy greater than that of a king upon his throne, only to go back to the toils of the living world?" End of quote. So, what do we do? Where is the life lesson? Is a life lesson even possible? Or do we wander about ridiculously on this filthy earth, murmuring in the mud, aimless, helpless, and ugly? Or do we wander about with high hopes, stoked by some opiate, whether it be the American dream, the Christian dream, or another dream of life that allows us to find shelter from the story, the simple story? Is it possible, after all, to live with death, the only authority against which rebellion is useless, at least so far? Is it possible then to live without this absolute authority? Have we come full circle, yet again, unable to decide for or against, and perhaps unable to live in that indecision? Dostoevsky famously asks, "Can rebels be happy?" Only you can answer this question.